Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our MPC online Bible study. I'm glad that you could be part of our study together tonight. As you know, every week, every Tuesday night, as part of our online study, we have a thought to think about, a question to ponder, a text to study. If you're able, restrictions permitted to meet up with someone during the week, to talk through what we're learning tonight. Obviously, that'd be really good. The purpose of this material is really for you to go away and talk about it and discuss it amongst yourselves as and when you're able to do that, be it in a life group or with someone else or a friend. Well, as you know, the last 2 weeks we were starting a series of teaching on the Psalms and the Song of Solomon. We first looked at the authorship of the book of Psalms, and then last week we were looking at the various types of Psalms. But tonight, what I wanted to look at, we're going to look at the greatest song of all the Psalms that I've ever written, and that is called the Song of Songs. And, just like we have the King of Kings, which speaks of the greatest King of all, or the Lord of Lords is the greatest Lord of all. So when we come to the Song of Songs, we are looking, in my view, as the greatest song of all. And now, some people have objected that the book Song of Songs should even be in the Bible at all. The content of the book for some would seem to be a bit explicit, and even in the book of Song of Songs, there's even no reference even to God as far as I'm aware. And yet, the book of the Song of Songs is possibly the most holy of all books in the whole of the Bible, because it describes something that is sacred in human relationships, and that is sexual intimacy. Sex is God's gift to marriage, and it is sacred in His sight. In fact, the Jewish rabbis call the book of the Song of Songs the Holy of Holies. In fact, there was a tradition amongst the Jewish rabbis going back many centuries apparently where they would take their shoes off when they would read it, because actually they regarded the book Song of Songs as a sacred book, as something that describes something that is sacred that happens between man and woman in marriage. And so as a book, Song of Songs doesn't appear to have any structure. It just seems to be a collection of love poetry, or an anthology of love poetry. Some phrases throughout the book seem a little bit out of touch today. So, for example, if I was to say to my special other or significant other, to say, your teeth are like a flock of sheep just shorn coming up from the washing, I don't think that's going to go down too well today in our culture, especially on a romantic occasion. And so clearly some of the phrases in the book of Song of Songs are culturally relevant and need to be seen in a cultural context. And things that may have seemed romantic back in those days may not seem so romantic today. This title is sometimes called Solomon's Song of Songs. Some scholars do not think that the title, or Song of Solomon, or Solomon's Song of Songs, refers necessarily to the authorship, but it is a collection of love songs in his name. It could be that it was a song written by someone who dedicated it to Solomon in honor of one of his marriages. We know throughout the Bible, and particularly in 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 29, that Solomon had written over 1,005 different songs. Some of those songs actually found their way into the book of Psalms. And so it's entirely plausible that Song of Songs was just one of the songs that he wrote for one of his wives. At the time of writing, we can see that Solomon already had 60 wives and 80 concubines. So it seems that of all the wives that Solomon actually did have, and he had 700 of them, and I wouldn't advise that by any means, and that this song was the song for the wife that actually was really God's choice for him. The song itself involves 3 groups of people. There's the male lover, there's the female beloved, and then there are the friends who speak in the first, second, and third personal pronouns. And this sometimes makes the book of Song of Songs difficult to follow. Some scholars actually see that this song is actually a song of a love triangle between the shepherd, the woman, and the king, where the king is wooing the woman away from the shepherd. But I think actually this might be a wrong interpretation of the Song of Songs, because it actually puts the king in a bad light. It could be that actually the shepherd and the king were the same person. Often throughout the Old Testament, the rulers of God's people, the kings, were often described as the shepherds of Israel. And so to help us understand a little bit of the background of this book, and to look at the theological importance of this book, I want to share with you, I think, what is essentially the background story behind the Song of Songs. Clearly, it shows that at some point throughout Solomon's reign, that he had a country estate to the north of Israel near Mount Hermon. And the estate had vineyards that were looked after by his tenants. And it appears that one of his tenants had died and left the estate into the care of his sons and daughters. And the oldest daughter actually ends up looking after the vineyard. Because of the nature of the outdoor work, her skin gets tanned, which in those days was deemed as unattractive. Obviously today it's the opposite. And so this woman would work in the vineyard and her skin would get tanned. One day she meets a young man, and enjoying their time together, they arrange to see each other again. After a number of meetings, they find themselves falling in love with each other. He then explains to her that he has to leave and attend to some business, but he promises that he will come back in the near future and that they will both get married. And so he leaves her for a while, and while the young man has gone, the young woman is excited, looking forward with a sense of anticipation of seeing him again and marrying him. And as time begins to pass, she wonders, will he renege on his promise? She starts to have nightmares that maybe that he will not return. And then one day she's out in the fields, and as she's out in the fields, she notices that there are horses and chariots arriving to the vineyard, and she receives news that King Solomon has arrived back to his country estate to see how things were going. As she aligns herself up with all the other, workers of the vineyard, King Solomon comes out of his chariot and makes his way into the vineyard, and the king walks directly towards her. And as Solomon approaches this woman, she looks into the face of the king, and she notices that actually this is the man that she had fell in love with before. That the man that she thought was actually a fellow worker or a shepherd in the field was actually King Solomon himself. And so King Solomon takes her to Jerusalem. The king marries her. But then she feels inferior to the other 60 wives that King Solomon had at that time. But he assures her that she is his only one true love, the lily between the thorns. Well, I think hopefully that will provide a little bit of a narrative background behind Song of Songs. But before we look at maybe just the Christian parallel and the theological importance of this book, when we're reading the Song of Songs, we do see a loose structure to it. Chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 7 describes love's strong desire. Chapter 2, verse 8 to 3 verse 5 describes love lost and found. Chapters 3, verse 6 to chapter 5, verse 1 is a celebration and the consummation of. Chapters 5, verse 2 to 8, verse 4, love's anxiety and consummation. And chapter 8, verse 5 to verse 14 is love's affirmation and consummation. And so how should we treat this Song of Songs, or some scholars call it the Song of Solomon. The Song of Songs, I believe, is to be thought of both as an affirmation and as an analogy. Let me explain that. Firstly, it should be seen as an affirmation of the gift of sexual intimacy between husband and wife in marriage. You know, our Western culture has a completely distorted view of human sexuality. I mean, marriage is being redefined to what God has originally intended it to mean, and the gift of sex is also being perverted or distorted in our culture. It's either seen as gross or it's made of, or as God. You know, historically, some aspects of the church have often have an opposition due to the influence of St. Augustine towards sex. But the other side of it is that our world very often has made a god of sex in our culture and has actually distorted and perverted this precious gift that God has given us. Sexual intimacy needs to be redeemed. And the Song of Solomon, I believe, or the Song of Songs, is a celebration of that in marriage. In fact, the New Testament celebrates sexual intimacy in marriage. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul explains that in marriage that a husband and wife are to fulfill their marital duties and responsibilities to each other in sexual intimacy. So we should affirm the gift of sexual intimacy in marriage. It is God's idea. It is to be redeemed as God intended it to be redeemed. But not only did I say the Song of Solomon an affirmation, it should also be seen as an analogy of the relationship between God and his people. The Song of Songs is not an allegory where the story has some hidden symbolic meaning. Rather, it is to be seen as an analogy where one reality explains another reality, where the love relationship between a husband and wife, in this case between Solomon and this country girl, is like the love between God and his people. Both are real, but the former is explaining the latter. Similar, throughout the Old Testament, God often portrays his relationship to his ancient people of Israel to that of as a husband and a wife, as a marriage relationship. God portrayed Hosea's marriage to his wife as his relationship to his people. In the Old Testament, we see this, as I mentioned, this pattern recurring quite often. And of course, when we come into the New Testament, we see that Christ is seen as the bridegroom and the church is seen as the bride, and that there is a relationship there between the bridegroom and the bride. And so it can be said that the relationship between our relationship with God is not by any means an erotic relationship, but it is an emotional relationship. There is an emotional connection between us and God at the most deepest personal level, so that we sing in the Song of Songs when we say that he has taken me into his banquet hall and his banner over me is love, and that I am my beloved and that he is mine. It describes the most intimate, emotional, deep spiritual connection that we have with Christ. And so in conclusion, the Christian life is about having a personal relationship with God. And as a Christ follower, we are to have a relationship with the Lord where we can speak honestly about what we're going through, our feelings. We can speak of our love for the Lord. We can be honest with God. And I think that the Psalms, as well as the Song of Songs helps us in that journey of growing in a deep relationship with God. Psalms helps us to handle our emotions in a right way, to bring our feelings and our thoughts under God's control. Song of Songs underlines the importance of intimacy in marriage. And for those of us who are not married, it underlines the importance of an emotional intimacy and connection with Christ as we look forward to the day when he will return and we will be united with him. Well, I hope you've got something out of our study, out of the Psalms and out of the Song of Solomon, and I trust that you've been edified in that. Just as a question to ponder, I want to give you this question to think about, and this question obviously is for you to go away, discuss amongst yourselves at some point. What would you say? How would you respond to someone who says that sex is dirty and shouldn't be talked about in church? Okay, so how would you respond to someone who says that sex is dirty and should not be talked about in church? Okay, and the text of study, I'd like you to read Song of Songs chapter 2. So read through the whole chapter, Song of Songs chapter 2, and then what I'd like you to do is focus particularly on verse 15 of that chapter. And as you focus on verse 15, I want you to meditate on those words. What do those words mean to you personally? What do those words mean to you personally? Well, I hope you've got something out of our study tonight, and hope to see you tonight in our Zoom prayer meeting at 7:30. Drop me an email if you don't know, if you want the access code to that, and I'll send it to you. Hey, have a great rest of the evening. Have a great rest of the week. Hope to see some of you guys on Sunday morning at our actual service. If you can't make it Sunday morning, we will still continue our online service. Bless you all, and see you soon. Bye.